The backpack was still on the hook. On the afternoon of November 4th, 1993, in the mountain town of Cedarfield, Colorado, population 2,800, a 7-year-old boy named Elijah Grant did not come home from school. His backpack, a green canvas JanSport, with a keychain shaped like a Colorado Rockies baseball clipped to the zipper, was still hanging on its hook by the front door of the Grant family home on Ridgeline Drive, because he hadn't needed it. It was a Wednesday. Wednesday was library day. Elijah walked 2 blocks down from Cedarfield Elementary to the public library at 3:15. And he did it every single week without anyone worrying. Because in Cedarfield in 1993, that was simply what children did. He never reached the library. What happened in the 45 minutes between 3:15 and 4 o'clock that afternoon would define Cedarfield for the next 31 years. Would put a particular dread into every parent on every block within range of Ridgeline Drive. Would turn a green canvas backpack into something no one in the Grant family could look at directly for a very long time. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to Cedarfield. Because to understand what was taken from that town on a November afternoon, you first have to understand who Elijah Grant was. Cedarfield sat at just under 8,000 feet in a valley between 2 ridges in central Colorado. The kind of town that existed because the mountain was there and somebody had decided to stay. By 1993, it had the character particular to mountain communities. A main street of maybe 5 blocks, a grocery store and a hardware store, and a video rental place called Summit Video that was the social center of town on Friday evenings. The ski resort 12 miles up the road brought visitors in winter, and the summers brought hikers, but Cedarfield itself remained a town of people who had chosen to be there and intended to stay. The Grant family had been in Cedarfield since Elijah's grandfather had moved up from Denver in 1961 to work the timber contracts. By 1993, Elijah's father, Marcus Grant, managed the front desk at the resort during ski season and drove a school bus for the district in the off months. His mother, Patricia, taught 2nd grade at Cedarfield Elementary, the same school Elijah attended, which meant she had spent the previous 2 years successfully pretending not to notice her own son in the hallway in order to protect his social reputation. A diplomatic effort he apparently appreciated. They lived in a wood frame house on Ridgeline Drive with a porch that caught the afternoon sun and a view of the eastern ridge that Patricia Grant would later describe, in every context imaginable, as the first thing that made her want to live there. Elijah Grant was 7 years old in November of 1993 and had already developed 2 consuming interests that the adults around him found alternately charming and exhausting. The first was birds. He had a field guide, a second-hand pair of binoculars that were slightly too heavy for his face, and an ongoing list, kept in a yellow spiral notebook his grandfather had given him, of every species he had identified in the valley. By November, the list was at 41. The second interest was his best friend, a boy named Tommy Osgood, who lived 3 houses down, and who, according to every adult in the neighborhood, would follow Elijah into any plan regardless of its wisdom or structural soundness. He was the kind of 7-year-old who asked his teachers follow-up questions, not to be difficult, because he actually wanted to know the answer. Patricia Grant had a name for this quality that she used at the kitchen table and in the school hallway and in every interview she gave for the next 3 decades, and the name was simply Elijah. Every Wednesday he walked to the library. He had a card. He knew the librarian, a woman named Ruth Alcott, by name, and she knew his name, and she kept a running mental note of which bird books she still needed to find for him. He had never once been late. He had never once failed to show up. The last ordinary image of Cedarfield is this: A clear November afternoon. The kind of cold that hadn't committed yet. The aspens on the ridge already stripped bare. The smell of someone's wood smoke settling into the valley as school let out. A boy in a red jacket, no backpack because it was library day, turning left out of the school's front door toward Oak Street. He was gone before the wood smoke cleared. Ruth Alcott called the school at 4:15. She had been watching the door since 3:30, which she would later explain was simply what you did when a child who had never once been late was not there. The school secretary transferred the call to Patricia Grant, who was still at her desk grading reading comprehension packets. Patricia was at the library in 4 minutes. Elijah was not there. He had not arrived. Ruth had not seen him at all. Patricia stood in the library vestibule for a moment that she has described in every subsequent interview as the moment the floor changed. Not moved, but changed, as though the tile beneath her feet had become a different material entirely. Then she called Marcus on the school's phone. Then Marcus called the Cedarfield Police Department. Officers arrived at Ridgeline Drive at 5:05. By 5:30, a search had been organized. By 6, the temperature was dropping toward the 20s, and the sky above the eastern ridge had gone the color of a bruise, and 60 people from Cedarfield were walking the 2-block route between the school and the library with flashlights, calling a name that came back to them off the hillside in a way that nobody who was there has forgotten. The route from Cedarfield Elementary to the Oak Street Library was a straight line down 2 blocks and a left turn. There was one gap in the sightlines, an alley behind the Summit Video building that cut between Oak and Pine Streets, running behind the dumpsters and the service entrance. It was a gap of maybe 40 feet, where a child walking along the edge of the sidewalk would have been briefly out of view from any direction. That gap was where Elijah Grant had last been, according to the single piece of evidence investigators recovered in the first 72 hours, a red jacket button, matching the coat Patricia had bought him at the beginning of the school year, found on the concrete lip of the alley behind Summit Video. One button, twisted off, the thread still in it. That button was logged, photographed, and placed in an evidence bag. It was the only physical evidence the Cedarfield Police Department would have for 30 years. The initial investigation moved fast and ran cold inside of 3 weeks. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation was called in within 48 hours. Agent Diane Holloway drove up from Denver on a Friday and spent 12 days in Cedarfield, interviewing residents, reviewing the physical search, and building a profile of the abductor that she would summarize in her preliminary report with 4 words that the Cedarfield police chief would later say he thought about every year on November 4th, someone they trusted first. The early suspects were few and careful. A man who had been reported acting strangely near the school in October was investigated and cleared. A registered offender living 40 miles east of Cedarfield was interviewed twice and accounted for. The owner of Summit Video, whose alley held the only physical evidence in the case, was questioned extensively. His name was Dennis Farrow. He was 44 years old, had lived in Cedarfield for 9 years, and was a fixture in the community in the way that anyone who ran the video rental store in a small mountain town in 1993 was a fixture. He had no record. His alibi for the afternoon of November 4th was soft. He said he'd been doing inventory alone in the back of the store, but soft alibis were not evidence, and the CBI could not place him at the alley. He was not charged. Agent Holloway noted Farrow's name in her report. She circled it lightly in pencil. She left Cedarfield in December. The family's account of those weeks runs on a different clock than the investigations. Marcus Grant told a Denver newspaper in 1994 that the hardest part was not the not knowing, because you could not survive the not knowing, so you had to convert it into something else. He converted it into motion. He repapered the entire county with flyers. He drove to every neighboring town once a week for 2 years. He stood in grocery store parking lots in ski season when the resort brought in new faces and looked at every one of them. Patricia kept teaching. She said later that she kept teaching because her students needed her, and because Elijah would have expected it of her, and because she understood from the first week that this was going to be a very long road, and she needed to know how to keep standing. Tommy Osgood, Elijah's best friend, was 8 years old when it happened. He told a school counselor that he thought it was his fault for not walking with Elijah that day. He was told, carefully and repeatedly, that it was not. He did not stop believing it was for many years. By 1998, 5 years into the case, the reward fund had reached $45,000, and the CBI had reviewed the file twice without new leads. Summit Video had closed. Dennis Farrow had moved away from Cedarfield in 1996, something that people in town noted and discussed and could do nothing about, because moving away was not a crime, and he had not been charged with anything. He relocated to Pueblo then, according to records, to a suburb of Albuquerque, New Mexico. He maintained no contact with Cedarfield. By 2003, 10 years after the alley on Oak Street, Cedarfield had changed in the way all small towns change when something terrible happens to a child. It hadn't, on the surface, changed at all. The main street still ran the same 5 blocks. There was a different video rental store for 3 years, and then no video rental store. The school still let out at 3:15. But Patricia Grant had stepped down from teaching in 2001. She had found, after 8 years, that standing in front of other people's 7-year-olds had become more than she could hold. Marcus Grant still drove the school bus. He drove it every morning and every afternoon for 24 years after his son disappeared. Every adult in Cedarfield who asked him why, and there were several, received the same answer in a different number of words. He said it was because he needed to be there, at the school, at the time. He needed to be present for the thing that he had not been present for. Nobody argued with him. Some mornings, parents standing at the corner would wave at him as the bus went by, and he would wave back, and everyone understood what they were both doing. Ruth Alcott retired from the library in 2011. At her retirement party, held in the library's reading room, she said that she had never stopped thinking about the boy who didn't walk through her door. The room was quiet in a way that retirement parties usually aren't. The CBI file on Elijah Grant was reviewed formally in 2010, 2015, and again in 2019, each review returning the same conclusion. The physical evidence was insufficient. The primary person of interest had moved out of state, and without new leads, the case would remain open but inactive. The button from the red jacket sat in an evidence bag in a Denver storage facility. It had been tested twice. Both times, the technology available had not been sufficient to extract a usable DNA profile from the thread. In 2019, a forensic lab in Virginia developed a new extraction protocol for degraded biological material on textile fibers. The technique could pull a workable profile from threads that older methods had written off entirely. The case had been cold for 26 years when somebody finally tried the new method on the red jacket button. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, and piecing together lives that deserved better. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, take a second to like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get back to Elijah. On a morning in February of 2022, a CBI analyst named Roger Espinoza was reviewing the results of a batch of cold case DNA extractions when a profile came back clean from a piece of evidence he almost hadn't submitted. The thread on the red jacket button from a 1993 case out of Cedarfield. The extraction had worked. The profile was clean and full. He submitted it immediately to the Federal CODIS database, the National Registry of DNA profiles from crime scenes and convicted offenders. There was no match. He then uploaded the profile to a forensic genealogy platform, the same approach that had cracked several other cold cases in recent years by cross-referencing crime scene DNA against the ancestry databases, where millions of ordinary people have uploaded their own genetic profiles while searching for relatives. He got a hit within 6 days. Not a suspect. A family cluster. The DNA on that button connected through a chain of second cousins and an aunt in Phoenix who'd uploaded her profile in 2020 looking for information about her grandmother's side of the family. To a family tree that eventually pointed to a single man, Dennis Farrow, formerly of Cedarfield, Colorado, currently living in Rio Rancho, New Mexico. Age 73, Roger Espinoza called his supervisor. The CBI called the Cedarfield Police Department. And a detective named Maria Salcedo, who had been with the department for 11 years and had read the Elijah Grant file twice on her own time, drove to Denver that same afternoon. What the investigation established in the following 8 weeks is documented in court records that run to 412 pages. The condensed version: Dennis Farrow had left Cedarfield in 1996, not because he had found a better opportunity, but because he had brought Elijah Grant with him. He had, in the years that followed, moved through 4 states with a boy he presented to neighbors and schools, and any official who asked as his nephew, the orphaned son of a deceased sister. The documentation he had obtained was crude by modern standards and adequate for its time. No one had looked hard enough at the right moment. By the time Elijah, who knew himself only as Ryan Farrow by then, was in middle school in Pueblo, the story had calcified around him and he had no other version to replace it with. He was 38 years old in 2024 and living in Flagstaff, Arizona, working as a park ranger for the U.S. Forest Service. He had built a quiet life. He had friends he trusted. He had a habit of keeping a running list of bird species he'd spotted on the job in a small notebook he carried in his chest pocket, which he would not have been able to explain if anyone had asked. He had also been having, for most of his adult life, a recurring fragment: a view from a porch of a ridge at a particular angle, a smell of wood smoke at altitude, a sound he could not quite place. He had never known what it belonged to. The call from the CBI came on a Thursday in April. He was on a trail when his supervisor reached him on the radio and told him he needed to come in. He would later say that he knew something had shifted before he knew what it was. He said the drive back down the mountain took about 20 minutes, and he spent most of it very still. Dennis Farrow was arrested at his home in Rio Rancho, New Mexico, on April 29, 2024, on charges that included kidnapping, interstate transportation of a minor, and related federal counts. He had lived in that house for 11 years. His neighbors described him as a private man who kept his yard tidy and occasionally helped with heavy lifting when asked. He had a dog. He fed the neighbor's cat when she traveled. Nobody had any idea. When agents arrived that morning, Farrow answered the door and looked at their badges and looked at their faces and said, "I've been waiting." He did not resist. He did not ask for a lawyer immediately. He sat down at his kitchen table and folded his hands and said nothing further for 47 minutes until his attorney arrived. He has maintained silence on the question of why in every proceeding since, offering nothing that any court or family has found satisfying or sufficient. He is currently awaiting trial. He has pleaded not guilty, a position that the evidence, the DNA, the paper trail through 4 states, the school records, the testimony of former neighbors who remember a nephew appearing in 1996, makes difficult to sustain. Legal observers familiar with the case have described the outcome as nearly certain. The community of Cedarfield learned about the arrest on a Friday afternoon. The police chief made a statement from the front steps of the municipal building. Several people in the crowd cried. Several others did not, because they had spent 30 years steeling themselves for news that was one kind of terrible, and the news that came was a different kind entirely, and it took a moment to process the difference. Tommy Osgood, who was by then 45 years old, who had grown up in Cedarfield and stayed, who worked at the district school as a counselor, heard the news from his wife, who heard it on the radio. He sat on his front porch for a long time afterward. Then he called Patricia Grant. The reunion between Elijah Grant and his family did not happen on camera. It was not filmed. What the family shared publicly, through a statement released 6 weeks after the arrest, is this: that they met in Flagstaff, in a private space, and that Elijah, the name his mother called him for the first time in 31 years, had brought his field notebook. He showed his father the bird list. Marcus Grant, who had driven a school bus in Cedarfield for 24 years because he needed to be present at the thing he hadn't been present for, looked at that notebook for a long time. The family statement said that Elijah remembered more than they had dared to hope. Not everything. Not the full shape of Ridgeline Drive or the layout of the house, but the feeling of the morning bus and something about a keychain and the particular angle of light that came off the eastern ridge in autumn. Fragments, enough. He had been keeping bird lists his entire life without knowing why. The legacy of this case is not simple. It accelerated a review of cold case evidence held in long-term storage across Colorado, leading to new extraction tests on biological material from 11 additional unsolved cases. The technique that cracked the Elijah Grant case, the 2019 Protocol for Degraded Textile Fibers, has since been used in 6 other jurisdictions. The case is now part of the CBI's training materials for cold case review. Every one of those outcomes owes something to a thread on a button that nobody discarded. There are harder questions here, too. What do we owe someone who was taken at 7 and built a life inside a lie, who is now 38 and has to decide how to hold 2 histories at once? Elijah Grant has not given many interviews. He has said, in the one statement he released personally, that he is grateful for the people who kept looking and sorrier than he can say for the years lost, and that he is taking things one day at a time, which is not a small thing to be doing. Marcus Grant retired from driving the school bus in the spring of 2024, 3 weeks after the arrest. He had driven that route for 24 years. He gave no statement when he retired. He just didn't come back the following Monday. Everyone in Cedarfield understood. What this case asks us to consider about patience, about evidence, about the people who stay when institutions move on, is not comfortable. The red jacket button sat in a storage facility for 26 years before the right technology existed. Dennis Farrow lived freely for 31 years, while a family drove routes and posted flyers, and stood in parking lots waiting to recognize a face. The CBI reviewed that file 3 times. The right question, can we try the button again with the new protocol, was not asked until 2021. How many other cases are waiting for a question nobody has thought to ask yet? What detail in this story stays with you? And what do you think justice looks like for a man who spent 31 years hiding in plain sight, and a family that spent 31 years looking? Leave your thoughts below, and let us know where in the world you're watching from tonight. Justice found Elijah Grant after 31 years. Stories like his are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing, no matter how long it takes, subscribe. More cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.